In a town where everyone knows your name, someone found a face that shouldn't exist. A photograph from 1911 shows a child with features so precise, so unmistakable, that every neighbor stopped breathing when they saw it. The child in that picture is alive today, walking the same streets, attending the same school, living the same life, and nobody can explain how that's possible. Before this mystery fades into silence, subscribe to the channel and stay with stories that refuse to be forgotten. Shelby sits in the northwest corner of Montana, pressed against wheat fields that stretch beyond sight, and mountains that hold more secrets than snow. The town has 400 souls, maybe less depending on the season, and the kind of stillness that makes strangers uncomfortable but locals call peace. Everyone here knows everyone else, not just by name but by bloodline, by history, by the stories their grandparents told around wood stoves in winter. It's the kind of place where a single photograph can shake the foundations of everything people believed. And in the spring of last year, that's exactly what happened. The photograph surfaced in the basement of the old mercantile building on Main Street, a structure built in 1889 that had served as general store, post office, and gathering place for generations. During renovations meant to turn the space into a small museum, workers pulled up floorboards darkened by a century of boot traffic and found a metal box wedged between the joists. Inside were documents, receipts, ledgers, and a stack of photographs bound with string that had long since rotted into fragments. Most of the images showed faces familiar to the town, ancestors whose portraits hung in living rooms and whose names marked graves in the cemetery on the hill. But one photograph made the contractor stop working, made him call the museum director, made both of them call the sheriff. The picture showed a child, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, standing in front of what was clearly the Shelby train depot in its early days. The depot's original sign was visible behind the child, along with details that matched historical records from 1911 exactly. The child wore clothes consistent with the era, a simple cotton dress with a high collar and boots that looked hand-stitched. But it was the face that created the problem. The face was identical, feature for feature, to a child currently living in Shelby, a second grader named Emma Clark, who attended the small elementary school 3 blocks from where the photograph was found. Not similar, identical. The museum director, a woman named Patricia Moore, who had lived in Shelby for 60 years and knew every family tree by heart, brought the photograph to Emma's mother without telling anyone else. She knocked on the door of the Clark house on a Tuesday afternoon, her hands shaking as she held the image in a folder pressed against her chest. When Sarah Clark opened the door and Patricia showed her the photograph, Sarah's face went pale in a way that Patricia had only seen once before, at a funeral for a child who'd drowned in the Marias River. Sarah stared at the picture for 3 full minutes without speaking, then quietly asked Patricia to come inside and close the door behind her. The 2 women sat at the kitchen table, while Emma played in the backyard, her laughter drifting through the window like it belonged to a different world entirely. Sarah examined the photograph under the bright overhead light, turning it over to see the faded notation on the back, written in pencil. Shelby Depot, April 1911. The handwriting was neat, practiced, the kind people used when writing mattered and ink was precious. Patricia watched Sarah's face cycle through disbelief, confusion, fear, and something else that looked almost like recognition. Finally, Sarah spoke, and what she said made Patricia's blood run cold. "This isn't the first time I've seen something like this." Sarah explained that her grandmother, who had passed away 15 years earlier, had once shown her a collection of old family photographs kept in a trunk in the attic. Among them was an image of a young girl that Sarah's grandmother claimed was Sarah herself as a child. But Sarah knew that couldn't be true, because the photograph showed details from decades before Sarah was born, buildings that had been torn down, cars that belonged to a different era. Sarah's grandmother had laughed it off, saying the past liked to play tricks, that some families carried faces forward through time like heirlooms. Sarah had dismissed it as the rambling of an old woman losing her grip on memory. Now, holding a photograph of her daughter from 1911, she wondered if her grandmother had been trying to tell her something far more disturbing. Patricia and Sarah agreed to keep the discovery quiet while they tried to understand it. But in a town of 400 people, secrets have a half-life measured in hours. By the end of the week, everyone in Shelby knew about the photograph. Some thought it was a hoax. a clever manipulation made possible by modern technology, despite the fact that the image was printed on period-correct paper and showed age-appropriate deterioration. Others believed it was a coincidence, that human faces repeated themselves through random genetic combinations, though none of them could explain why the resemblance was so absolute. A few people, mostly the older residents who remembered stranger stories from their own childhoods, simply nodded and said the land around Shelby had always been unusual. The town began to investigate, in the way small communities do, through conversation and shared memory rather than official inquiry. People searched their own attics and basements for old photographs, comparing faces across decades, looking for patterns. They found dozens of images that showed resemblances between ancestors and descendants, which was expected, but they also found 3 other photographs that created the same impossible recognition as Emma's. Pictures of children from the early 1900s who looked exactly like children living in Shelby today. Each photograph came with notations, dates, locations, all documented and preserved. Each one defied explanation. The Historical Society, a group of 5 dedicated volunteers who met monthly in the library basement, expanded their search beyond photographs. They pulled census records, birth certificates, death records, land deeds, anything that might provide context. What they discovered was that Shelby had an unusual pattern in its population, a cycling that nobody had noticed because it happened so slowly. Families would arrive, stay for 2 or 3 generations, then leave. Decades later, families with different surnames but similar origins would arrive and settle in the same houses, work the same land, attend the same church. The pattern repeated every 70 to 90 years, like a tide that moved through time instead of across water. One of the researchers, a retired teacher named Donald Gray, noticed something else in the records. Children born in Shelby during specific years, particularly those ending in 1 or 2, often shared unusual characteristics beyond physical appearance. They excelled in the same subjects, showed the same talents, had the same fears. Medical records from the old clinic, preserved in boxes that smelled of mildew and age, showed these children reported the same dreams, the same sense of having lived before, the same unexplained knowledge of events they couldn't possibly remember. The doctors had noted these similarities, but dismissed them as the result of small-town culture, where everyone shared experiences and stories until individual memory blurred into collective myth. But that was only the surface of something much deeper. Emma's mother, Sarah, decided to ask her daughter directly if she remembered anything unusual, anything that might explain the photograph. She approached the conversation carefully, sitting with Emma on the back porch while the sun set over the wheat fields and turned the sky the color of rust. She showed Emma the photograph without explaining what it meant, simply asked if Emma recognized the place or the person. Emma looked at the image for a long time, her small fingers tracing the outline of the child's face. Then she said something that made Sarah's hands go numb. "That's the depot before they painted it blue. I remember when it was brown like that." The Shelby train depot had been painted blue in 1958, part of a civic improvement project documented in the local newspaper. It had been brown before that, just as Emma described. But Emma was 7 years old, born in a year when the depot had been blue for more than 6 decades. There was no way she should know what color it had been in 1911. Sarah asked how she knew, and Emma shrugged with the casual certainty children have before the world teaches them doubt. "I just remember," she said. "I remember lots of things from before." Sarah pressed gently, asking what else Emma remembered, and the child's answers came without hesitation or confusion. She remembered the sound of steam engines, the smell of coal smoke, the way the platform would shake when heavy freight cars rolled through. She remembered a woman who sold ribbons from a cart outside the depot, and a man who played fiddle on Saturday afternoons, and how the wheat fields looked when they were harvested with horses instead of machines. She remembered these things the way other children remember their last birthday party, as events that had happened and left impressions. Sarah recorded the conversation on her phone, her voice steady even as everything inside her was collapsing. The recording spread through Shelby within days, passed from phone to phone in parking lots and church basements and across kitchen tables. Some people dismissed it as a child's imagination, fed by stories she'd heard from adults or seen in books. But others recognized the details Emma described, specifics that appeared in old journals and letters but had never been published or publicly shared. The woman with the ribbon cart had been real, mentioned in a diary kept by a shopkeeper's wife. The fiddle player had existed too, noted in a complaint filed with the town council about noise during services. Emma described things she should not have known, could not have known, unless memory worked in ways that nobody understood. Subscribe now, because what happens next will change how you see everything. The town held a meeting in the community center, a building that had once been the original schoolhouse and still carried the scent of old wood and chalk dust. Nearly 200 people attended, filling the folding chairs and standing along the walls, their faces showing the same mixture of fear and fascination that always accompanies the impossible. Patricia Moore presented the photographs, the research, the patterns in the records. Donald Gray explained the cycling of families and the documented similarities between children across generations. Sarah played the recording of Emma's memories, and the room fell silent, except for the sound of her daughter's voice describing a world that had ended before anyone present was born. The meeting lasted 3 hours and reached no conclusions, but it did establish that Shelby was confronting something beyond normal experience. Some attendees argued for scientific investigation, suggesting DNA tests and psychological evaluations and expert analysis. Others insisted the phenomenon was spiritual, evidence of reincarnation or ancestral memory or divine mystery. A few people, mostly those who had lived in Shelby their entire lives, simply stated that the land itself was the answer, that the place had its own rules and always had. The meeting ended with agreement to continue researching but to protect the children involved, particularly Emma, from outside attention that might turn them into spectacles. Within a month, 3 more children in Shelby demonstrated the same impossible memories. A 5-year-old boy named Lucas described the interior of a church that had burned down in 1923, including details about the placement of pews and the pattern of the stained glass that matched surviving photographs. A 9-year-old girl named Sophie knew the original route of a creek that had been diverted in 1919, drawing a map that aligned perfectly with surveyor records stored in the county archive. An 8-year-old boy named Michael recited the words to a song that had been popular in 1910, but hadn't been recorded or written down, a tune his great-great-grandmother had mentioned in a letter discovered in the Historical Society's collection. Each child spoke of these memories naturally, without understanding why they were unusual. The parents of these children formed a quiet alliance, meeting privately to share information and support each other through the strangeness. They discovered that each of their children had been born during years ending in specific numbers, part of the pattern Donald Gray had identified in the records. They also found that their own families, when traced back through genealogy records, had roots in Shelby during the early 1900s, then gaps where ancestors had left, then returns in later decades. The cycling pattern wasn't random. It was connected to bloodlines, to families that kept coming back to Shelby as if drawn by something they couldn't resist or escape. Sarah Clark became the unofficial spokesperson for the group, not because she wanted the role, but because Emma's case was the most documented and undeniable. She began corresponding with researchers who studied memory, reincarnation, genetics, anything that might provide a framework for understanding. Most of the experts she contacted dismissed the evidence as coincidence or suggestion, but a few took her seriously, particularly those who had encountered similar patterns in other locations, places where the past seemed to bleed through into the present in ways that defied conventional explanation. One researcher mentioned a town in New England where children had been born with memories of a plague that had ended 300 years earlier. Another described a village in Scotland where specific families produced children who knew details of a battle that had happened on their land in medieval times. The common thread in all these cases was isolation, small communities where people stayed for generations, where the land itself became part of identity. The researcher who had studied the Scottish village suggested that Shelby's location might be significant, built on land that indigenous peoples had considered sacred or dangerous, a place where the boundary between past and present was thinner than elsewhere. Sarah researched local Native American history and found that the Blackfeet and other tribes had indeed regarded the area around Shelby as a place of vision and memory, somewhere people went to speak with ancestors or see across time. The land had a reputation long before white settlers arrived and built a railroad town on top of ancient patterns. But the truth was still waiting to be revealed. Emma began having dreams that were more than dreams, experiences so vivid and detailed that she would wake up disoriented, unsure which time she belonged to. She dreamed of being the child in the photograph, standing at the depot waiting for a train that never came. She dreamed of a journey that was supposed to happen, a trip that would take her away from Shelby to a place her family needed to reach. But something had prevented the journey. Something had stopped the train, and she had stayed in Shelby instead. The dream repeated with slight variations, always ending with the same feeling of waiting, of being suspended between departure and arrival, between one life and the possibility of another. Sarah took Emma to a child psychologist in Great Falls, the nearest city large enough to have specialized services. The psychologist, a kind woman named Dr. Helen Warren, listened to Emma's descriptions and reviewed the documentation Sarah had brought. She ran standard assessments for memory, cognition, suggestibility, anything that might explain how a 7-year-old could describe events from 1911 with such precision. The results showed Emma was a normal child in every measurable way. Intelligent, but not unusually so. Imaginative but grounded, with no signs of psychological disorder or external influence. Dr. Warren admitted she had no explanation for Emma's memories and suggested that perhaps some experiences existed outside the framework of current psychological understanding. During one of these sessions, Emma drew a picture that Dr. Warren found particularly significant. The drawing showed the train depot with a group of children standing on the platform, all of them holding small suitcases and wearing clothes from the early 1900s. Behind them stood adults who looked sad, and in the sky above the depot, Emma had drawn what looked like threads or strings connecting each child to different points beyond the frame. When Dr. Warren asked what the threads meant, Emma said they were the places the children were supposed to go, but couldn't reach. "We were supposed to leave," Emma said, "but the train couldn't take us, so we stayed, and then we came back." The statement suggested something more complex than simple reincarnation or genetic memory. It implied intention, a pattern that was actively maintained rather than randomly occurring. Sarah shared the drawing and Emma's explanation with the other parents, and together they began to develop a theory that felt impossible, but fit the evidence better than any alternative. What if the children of Shelby in 1911 had been meant to leave, to scatter to other places and live different lives? But some event had prevented their departure. What if that prevention had created a kind of temporal loop, where those same souls, those same essential selves, kept returning to Shelby across generations, unable to move forward, forever waiting for the journey that never happened? The Historical Society searched for records of any significant event in April 1911, the month noted on the photograph of Emma's impossible twin. They found a notation in the railroad company's archives, a brief mention of a scheduled passenger train that had been cancelled due to track damage from spring flooding. The train was supposed to carry families leaving Shelby for new opportunities in Washington state, part of a homesteading wave that drew people west in those years. Dozens of families had planned to go, had sold their property, had packed their lives into trunks and cases. But the flooding had washed out a bridge 30 miles from town, and by the time repairs were made, the opportunity in Washington had closed. The families had nowhere to go. Most had stayed in Shelby, rebuilt their lives in the only place they had left. The children who had been photographed at the depot that April, waiting for a train that never arrived, were all documented in the 1920 census, still living in Shelby. By the 1930 census, most of them were gone, having moved away as adults to find work during the Depression. Their names disappeared from Shelby's records, but their faces, it seemed, had never left. The cycling pattern that Donald Gray had identified began approximately 70 years after 1911, when new families with children bearing impossible resemblances started arriving in town. The cycle had repeated twice since then, each time bringing back faces that belonged to the children who had missed that train. One of the older residents, a woman named Margaret Foster, who was 93 and had lived in Shelby since childhood, came forward with a memory that had haunted her for decades. She remembered her grandmother telling her about the canceled train, about how the children had cried on the platform, about how some of the parents had said the land wouldn't let them leave. Margaret's grandmother had been one of those parents, and she had told Margaret that Shelby had a way of holding on to what belonged to it, that some places were like that, hungry for the people who made them real. Margaret had thought it was just an old woman's way of explaining disappointment and missed chances. Now she wondered if her grandmother had understood something true about the nature of the place they lived, but something even stranger was about to emerge from the past. Donald Gray found another document in the courthouse archives, a letter written in 1912 by a local minister to a colleague in Helena. The letter described a troubling phenomenon he had observed in Shelby following the cancelled journey. Parents reported that their children, particularly those who had been most excited about leaving, had become withdrawn and strange. They spoke of feeling trapped, of having dreams about other lives they were supposed to live, of seeing themselves in places they had never been. Some children claimed to remember the future, describing events that would happen decades later with unsettling accuracy. The minister had tried to address this through prayer and counsel, but the strangeness had persisted for years before gradually fading as the children grew into adolescence and the memories seemed to dim. The letter went on to describe the minister's theory, which he admitted sounded like madness even to his own ears. He believed that the children had somehow become unstuck in time at the moment of their greatest intention to leave. Their spirits, or souls, or essential selves reaching forward toward the lives they were meant to live, while their bodies remained anchored in Shelby. This division had created a kind of wound in their being, a split that allowed them to exist partially and multiple times at once. He believed this wound could be inherited, passed down through bloodlines, explaining why some families in Shelby seemed particularly susceptible to temporal confusion. The letter ended with a plea for guidance that apparently was never answered, as there was no record of a reply in the minister's papers. Sarah shared this letter with Emma's doctor and with the other parents, and it became the foundation for a new understanding of what was happening. The children in Shelby today, who carried memories of 1911, were not experiencing reincarnation in the traditional sense. They were experiencing a kind of temporal echo, a resonance created by the unfinished journey of their ancestors. The children who had been photographed at the depot in 1911, waiting for a train that never came, had created such a powerful intention to leave, to begin new lives, that the intention itself had become embedded in their family lines like genetic code. Each time a descendant was born in Shelby during a year that aligned with the original pattern, that intention activated, bringing with it memories and knowledge that belonged to a different time. The question that nobody could answer was whether this pattern could be broken, or if it was meant to continue indefinitely. Some of the parents began to consider leaving Shelby, taking their children away from the place that seemed to trap them in repeating cycles. But others argued that leaving might make things worse, that the children needed to be in Shelby to make sense of what they were experiencing, that the land itself was part of whatever process was unfolding. The debate created tension in the small community, dividing families and friendships in ways that reminded the older residents of conflicts from previous generations, arguments that had happened before and been forgotten until they happened again. Emma's dreams became more intense, more specific, and she began to draw detailed maps of places that didn't exist anymore, buildings that had been demolished, roads that had been rerouted, landscapes that had been altered by decades of agriculture and development. Sarah collected these drawings and compared them to historical photographs and maps, finding that Emma's memory dreams were accurate down to tiny details, like the placement of fence posts and the shapes of individual trees. It was as if Emma could close her eyes and see Shelby as it had been in 1911, not through imagination but through direct perception, as if the past was still happening somewhere she could access. Dr. Warren suggested hypnotherapy as a way to explore Emma's memories more safely, to create a controlled environment where the child could describe what she was experiencing without the fear and confusion that came with spontaneous recall. Sarah agreed, and during a session in late summer, Emma entered a light trance state and began to speak in a voice that sounded slightly different from her normal speech, older and more formal. She described standing at the depot with her family, holding a small case that contained a doll and a book and a photograph of her grandparents. She described the excitement she felt about the journey, about seeing mountains and ocean, and living in a house her father would build with his own hands. She described the moment when the railroad official came to tell them the train wasn't coming, the way the news spread through the crowd like cold wind, the sound of her mother crying. Then Emma described something that hadn't appeared in any historical record. She said that after everyone left the depot, After the families had returned to their homes carrying their packed belongings like broken promises, the children had made a pact. They had gathered in the old schoolhouse that night, more than 20 of them, and they had sworn that they would find a way to make the journey eventually, that this wasn't the end. One of the older boys, a child named Thomas who seemed to be a leader among them, had suggested that if they couldn't go west in body, they would go west in spirit, that they would find a way through time itself. The children had held hands and spoken words that Thomas claimed would bind them to their intention, would ensure that one way or another, they would complete the journey they had been denied. Sarah and Dr. Warren exchanged glances during this description, both of them recognizing that Emma was describing something that sounded like a ritual, a deliberate attempt to manipulate reality through will and collective belief. Emma continued, saying that Thomas had told them time was like a river with many currents, that a person could step into the water in one year and step out in another if they knew how to swim. He had promised them they would find the right current eventually, that they just needed to wait and watch for the opportunity. The session ended with Emma coming out of the trance state peacefully, with no memory of what she had said, but a feeling of relief, as if speaking the words had released pressure she didn't know she was carrying. Thomas's name appeared in the historical records as Thomas McKinley, born in Shelby in 1903, one of the children photographed at the depot in April 1911. He had remained in Shelby until 1929, then disappeared from all records. No death certificate, no marriage record, no census entry. The trail went completely cold, as if he had simply ceased to exist, or had finally found the current he was looking for. Sarah searched for any descendants of the McKinley family, and found none in Shelby, though there were McKinleys scattered through Montana and other towns. She contacted several of them, asking if they knew anything about Thomas, and most had never heard of him. But one woman, a great-niece living in Billings, said her grandmother had mentioned an uncle who had gone missing, who had left a journal filled with strange drawings and writing that nobody could understand. The journal had been thrown away years ago, dismissed as the ravings of someone who had lost his mind. The story Thomas had told the other children, about time being like a river with many currents, had apparently been more than a metaphor to him. The drawings his great-niece described sounded like maps or diagrams, attempts to chart the flow of temporal currents, to identify points where one could move between different streams of time. If Thomas had actually believed this was possible, if he had dedicated his life to finding a way to complete the journey the children had been denied, then his disappearance took on new significance. Perhaps he hadn't died or moved away. Perhaps he had found what he was looking for, a doorway through time that led to the life he was supposed to have lived. And perhaps the other children, the ones who had stayed in Shelby and lived normal lives and died in normal ways, had left something behind, some part of themselves that kept reaching for that same doorway. That reaching, passed through generations like a genetic memory, might be what Emma and the other children were experiencing now. They weren't remembering past lives in the conventional sense. They were accessing an intention that had never been fulfilled, a journey that existed in a state of permanent potential, always about to happen, but never completed. The children of Shelby in the present day were the latest inheritors of that unfulfilled intention, and their memories of 1911 were not memories at all, but rather glimpses of the moment when the journey should have begun, the point in time where their ancestors had become stuck between leaving and staying. Sarah presented this theory to the group of parents and researchers, and it was met with a mixture of acceptance and resistance. Some found it compelling, a framework that explained the impossible patterns and memories. Others thought it was too fantastical, that they were building elaborate mythology around what might be simple genetic coincidence or unconscious exposure to historical information. The debate continued through the fall as the children continued to demonstrate knowledge they shouldn't possess, and Shelby continued to feel like a place where the past refused to stay buried. Then something happened that changed everything. On a cold morning in November, Emma woke up and told her mother she knew how to finish the journey. She said it had come to her in a dream, not as words but as a feeling, a certainty that settled in her chest like a warm stone. The journey wasn't about physical travel anymore, she explained. It was about letting go of the moment, releasing the grip that the children of 1911 had maintained for more than a century on their intention to leave. As long as that intention remained unfulfilled and active, the pattern would continue. Children would keep being born with memories that didn't belong to them. Shelby would keep holding on to what it had claimed. But if the intention could be released, if someone could finally say on behalf of all those children that the journey was over and it was all right to rest, then the cycle might break. Emma said she wanted to go to the depot, which still stood, though it no longer served trains, and speak words of release for the children who had gathered there in 1911. Sarah didn't know if this would accomplish anything, but she saw no harm in allowing Emma to try. They gathered the other parents and children, and on a Saturday afternoon when the light slanted gold across the wheat fields and the air carried the first hint of winter, they walked together to the old depot. Emma stood where the photograph showed her impossible twin had stood, and she spoke words that came from somewhere deeper than her 7 years should allow. She thanked the children of 1911 for their hope and their courage, for trying to find a way forward when the world had closed a door. She told them the journey they had planned was beautiful, but that it didn't need to happen anymore, that the lives they had lived instead, right here in Shelby, had been enough. She told them it was time to rest, to let go of the reaching, to trust that the place where they had landed was where they were meant to be. She told them that their descendants, the children carrying their faces and their memories, would be all right, would live full lives unbound by longing for a past that never quite happened. She told them goodbye with a gentleness that made every adult present weep. When Emma finished speaking, she looked at her mother and smiled, and Sarah saw something in her daughter's eyes that looked like freedom. The other children who had been experiencing the memories reported in the following weeks that the vividness had faded, that the past no longer pressed into the present with the same intensity. They still remembered what they had seen and known, but it felt distant now, like a story they had heard rather than something they had lived. The dreams stopped. The spontaneous knowledge of things they shouldn't know began to dim. Shelby remained the same small town it had always been, but something about the quality of time there felt different, less layered, more singular. Patricia Moore continued her work with the Historical Society, documenting everything that had happened and creating an archive for anyone who might need it in the future. Donald Gray finished his research on the cycling patterns and published a small book about Shelby's unusual history, though he left out the most impossible parts, knowing nobody outside the town would believe them. Sarah kept the photograph of Emma's twin, not in a box or a folder, but in a frame on the wall, a reminder that the past is never as far away as we think, and that some mysteries exist to teach us how little we understand about the nature of time and identity and memory. The train depot still stands at the edge of town, weathered but solid, a place where children sometimes play without knowing they're walking on ground where others once waited for a journey that never came. The wheat fields still roll toward the mountains in golden waves, and the wind still carries voices if you listen closely enough. Shelby remains a town where everyone knows your name, where history lives in more than books, where the boundary between past and present is sometimes thin enough to see through. And every so often, when a child is born in a year that aligns with old patterns, the parents watch carefully for signs of memory that doesn't belong, ready to help their child understand that some journeys take generations to complete, and some completions look nothing like we expect. Emma Clark is 9 years old now, thriving in school, interested in art and horses and the ordinary magic of childhood. She remembers the depot and the release she spoke there, remembers the feeling of something heavy lifting away. When people ask her about the photograph, about being the child who solved Shelby's greatest mystery, she shrugs and says it wasn't really a mystery at all. The children from 1911 just needed someone to tell them it was okay to stop waiting. She was happy to be that person, to give them permission to rest. Now she lives her own life, makes her own memories, walks through time in only one direction like everyone else. But sometimes, when the light is right and the air is still, she stands at the depot and feels them there. The children who look like her and her friends, the ones who stood in the same spot more than a century ago with hope in their hearts and cases in their hands. She feels them not as ghosts, but as echoes, patterns in the fabric of a place that remembers everything, forgets nothing, and holds what it loves with a grip that transcends the simple progression of years. She feels them, and she smiles, and she knows that every ending is also a beginning, that every release creates space for something new, that time is stranger and more generous than anyone imagines. The photograph remains, impossible and undeniable, proof that some things exist outside explanation, that mystery is not always meant to be solved, but simply witnessed and honored. Shelby keeps its secrets the way small towns do, written in the land and the bloodlines and the stories passed from one generation to the next. The children grow, the seasons turn, the wheat fields accept the snow and then the sun, and life continues in the patient rhythm of a place that knows it exists in more than 3 dimensions, that understands the past and present are not separate rooms, but rather different angles of the same eternal moment. And if you walk through Shelby today, if you stand at the depot where the photograph was taken and close your eyes and listen, you might hear what Emma heard that November afternoon when she spoke her words of release. You might hear the sound of children laughing, of parents calling them home, of a train whistle in the distance that never quite arrives. You might feel the presence of all the lives that almost were, all the journeys that almost happened, all the futures that exist in permanent potential just beyond the edge of the world we see. You might understand, if only for a moment, that time is not a line, but a spiral, not a river, but an ocean, and that we are all swimming in currents we cannot see toward shores we have already reached. The mystery of Shelby is not that it happened, but that it continues to happen, that it exists in a space where past and present touch like hands across a table, where memory is not individual but collective, where the land itself participates in the story of the people who live on it. The mystery is that a child in 1911 and a child today can be the same person and different people simultaneously. That identity can echo across time without violating the integrity of either moment. The mystery is that we accept so easily the limitations we place on reality, that we assume time works one way because that's how we experience it, never considering that our experience might be only one current among many. Emma Clark and the other children of Shelby, who carried impossible memories, are not anomalies or exceptions to natural law. They are evidence that natural law is larger and stranger than we have been willing to acknowledge, that consciousness and time and place interact in ways we are only beginning to understand. They are proof that when people gather with shared intention, when they focus their will and their hope on a single point, they create ripples that can travel through decades and centuries, affecting lives that have not yet begun. They are teachers, showing us that the past is not dead, the future is not absent, and the present is not singular but plural, containing multitudes of moments that exist simultaneously if we know how to look. The story of Shelby will continue whether anyone tells it or not, because it is written into the foundation of the place, into the genetic code of the families who keep returning, into the consciousness of the land itself. The depot will stand or fall, the photographs will fade or be preserved, the children will remember or forget, but the truth beneath all of it remains constant. We are all connected across time in ways we cannot measure, cannot prove, can only feel in moments when the ordinary world cracks open and shows us the vast, strange, beautiful complexity that lives beneath the surface of everyday experience. What happened in Shelby is not unique because it happened in Shelby. It is unique because it was noticed, documented, honored, released. How many other towns carry similar patterns that nobody sees because they're not looking, because the evidence is scattered, because the story doesn't fit the framework of what we believe is possible? How many other children walk through the world carrying memories that don't belong to their own lifetime, dismissed as imagination or explained away as coincidence? How many other places exist where the past bleeds through into the present, where time moves in circles rather than lines, where the boundary between what was and what is remains permeable and alive? These questions have no answers because the questions themselves are the answer, reminding us that mystery is not a problem to be solved but a condition to be inhabited. Shelby's gift is not the explanation it provides, but the uncertainty it preserves, the way it refuses to resolve into simple narrative or comfortable conclusion. The children who found their faces in photographs from 1911 did not discover who they were, but rather how impossible it is to answer that question with any certainty, how identity itself might be a story we tell rather than a fact we possess. Some mysteries live in the space between knowing and not knowing, between proof and faith, between the world as we see it and the world as it might be. Shelby exists in that space permanently, A town that looks ordinary in every way except for the thin places where time folds back on itself and children speak with voices that remember things they never lived. To live in Shelby is to accept that reality is larger than reason, that truth is stranger than fiction, and that some stories are true precisely because they are impossible. And now you know what the residents of Shelby know, what they have chosen to protect and preserve, rather than explain away or deny. You know that a child today can be identical to a child from 1911, not through accident, but through pattern, not through coincidence, but through intention that transcends individual lifetimes. You know that a photograph can be more than an image, that it can be a doorway, a message, a connection across decades that proves time is not the tyrant we imagine, but rather a medium we move through in ways we barely understand. The children of 1911 who stood at the depot waiting for a journey that never came are not gone. They are here, in the faces of their descendants, in the memories that surface like dreams, in the land that holds them close and refuses to forget. They are the proof that when people invest enough hope and intention into a single moment, that moment becomes eternal, existing not in the past, but in a kind of permanent now that future generations can access and inherit. They are the evidence that we are all part of a story much larger than our individual lives, a story written in the fabric of time itself. The train never came to take those children west, but they found another way to journey, through bloodlines and memory, and the mysterious persistence of unfulfilled intention. They traveled not through space, but through time, arriving in Shelby again and again, wearing different faces that were somehow the same faces, living different lives that were somehow the same life. And perhaps in the end, that journey was more profound than the one they originally planned, teaching them and us that destination matters less than the courage to keep reaching, that completion takes forms we never expect, that the deepest journeys happen in the heart and mind and soul rather than on any map. Emma released them with her words at the depot, gave them permission to rest, but the pattern they created remains, not as a burden but as a gift, evidence that love and hope and intention can transcend death and time, and all the boundaries we imagine separate us from each other and from our own past. Shelby is a small town in Montana where the wheat fields meet the sky, and everyone knows your name, and the past lives in the present like a resident rather than a visitor. It is ordinary and extraordinary, mundane and miraculous, a place where the impossible became visible long enough to teach a lesson about the nature of reality itself. The mystery isn't solved. The mystery is ongoing, living, breathing, waiting in the archives and the photographs and the memories of children who know things they shouldn't know. It continues in the depot that still stands, in the families that still cycle through decades, in the land that still remembers and refuses to let go. And it will continue long after everyone who experienced this particular manifestation is gone, because some patterns are larger than individual lives. Some stories are told across generations, and some places exist to remind us that the world is far stranger and more wonderful than we allow ourselves to believe. The truth of Shelby is that there is no single truth, only layers of experience and perception and memory that create a picture too complex for simple explanation. The children are themselves and their ancestors simultaneously. Time is linear and circular simultaneously. The past is gone and present simultaneously. These contradictions don't negate each other, but rather exist together in the space where mystery lives, where certainty gives way to wonder, where the only honest answer to most questions is that we don't know, but we're grateful for the question. Some mysteries endure not because they can't be solved, but because their value lies in remaining open, in resisting closure, in teaching us to live with uncertainty and marvel. What if the photograph from 1911 showing Emma's identical twin is not an anomaly, but a window into how reality actually works when we're not forcing it into boxes too small to hold its true shape? What if we are all more connected across time than we imagine, all carrying faces and memories and intentions from lives we think of as separate, but which might be threads in a single tapestry we cannot see because we're too close to the weaving? The children of Shelby gave permission for these questions to exist without requiring answers, gave permission for mystery to be honored rather than eliminated. They stood at the depot where past and present touched and spoke words of release and acceptance, teaching the rest of us that some things are meant to be felt rather than understood, witnessed rather than explained, carried rather than solved. They are still teaching that lesson. Every time someone looks at the photograph and feels the shock of recognition, every time someone stands in Shelby and senses the layers of time pressing close, every time someone allows themselves to consider that reality might be larger and stranger than the story we've been told. And the lesson continues, carried forward by the wheat fields and the mountains and the people who stay in Shelby, knowing what it holds, accepting the strangeness as part of the fabric of home. The lesson lives in the photograph still hanging on Sarah's wall, in the archives Patricia maintains, in the research Donald continues, in the memories Emma carries of being both herself and someone who lived a century ago. The lesson is written in the land, in the bloodlines, in the very air of a place that exists in more dimensions than 3, in more times than 1. What if everything we think we know about time is wrong, and places like Shelby are trying to show us the truth? What if memory is not individual but shared, not locked in single lifetimes, but flowing through families like genetic code, carrying experiences across decades until someone is finally ready to receive them? What if the children who make pacts and speak intentions create ripples in time itself, affecting lives that haven't been lived yet, ensuring that nothing is ever truly lost or forgotten or left incomplete? These are the questions Shelby asks without demanding answers. The gift it offers to anyone willing to sit with uncertainty and consider that the world is more mysterious than any explanation we could devise. The photograph proves nothing, except that something impossible happened and continues to happen, that somewhere in the fabric of reality, there are places where the rules we rely on bend and break and reveal themselves to be more flexible than we imagined. And that revelation, that crack in the certainty we use to navigate the world, might be the most valuable thing a mystery can offer. So the story ends where it began, with a child in Shelby whose face appears in a photograph from 1911, with a town that holds more than it shows, with time moving in directions that science doesn't account for, but which people have always known in their bones. The story ends with questions that have no answers, and answers that raise new questions, with a mystery that solved itself by being released rather than explained, with the understanding that some truths are too large for words and must be felt instead. And if you're still listening, still wondering, still feeling the pull of impossible photographs and children who remember lives they never lived, then you understand what Shelby has to teach. You understand that mystery is not the enemy of truth, but its deepest expression, that the world is far more alive and conscious and connected than we usually acknowledge, that time is a story we tell ourselves to make sense of something too vast to comprehend. The depot stands in Shelby, Montana, weathered by wind and time, but still solid, still waiting, still holding the memory of children who almost left but stayed instead. The photograph exists, impossible and undeniable, proof that we live in a world stranger than we know. The children grow and live and carry forward the pattern that made them, not as curse, but as connection, not as burden, but as bridge between what was and what is and what might be. The mysteries that matter most are the ones that don't end when the truth is found, but rather expand to reveal deeper mysteries beneath, questions that lead to more questions, answers that teach us how little we actually understand about the nature of existence itself. So subscribe to the channel and walk with us into the next impossible story that's waiting to be told.